Alright, so I have here the latest iPhone 14 Pro Max in the awesome new deep purple color. And I would say there's definitely been some exciting changes this year. Looking at the front of the phone, you can already see that the Pro iPhone models no longer have that signature notch. It's a significant departure that Apple has made, and they've done it in a way that I think adds some pretty useful multitasking functionality to the phone. Now, a quick bit of backstory on that notch. In order to maximize the amount of usable space on your phone, manufacturers have had to push the screen to the edge, quite literally, to the edge of the phone. But they've still needed to house things like the front-facing camera, and in the iPhone's case, the true depth camera and sensors for Face ID. And because you need to house these cameras, there have always been visual imperfections on the front screen of the phone. So phone manufacturers have had to get creative. How do you have a camera on the front of your phone without it being too intrusive? Well, some manufacturers have tried to minimize the size of the camera cutout, but we've seen some pretty creative solutions out there that do away with the cutouts completely, like motorized pop-ups and front-facing cameras that sit underneath the display. Since the iPhone X, Apple has never really bothered to hide their cutout, and they've really just stored everything in this huge notch on the front of the phone, which they've definitely gotten a bit of flack for. But this year, they've gotten a little creative with hiding it by introducing the dynamic island. The name might be a little pretentious, but I think it's actually quite functional. If you look at it closely, you'll see that there's actually two cutouts. One for the Face ID true depth camera and sensors, and one for the front-facing camera. And in between, they filled the empty space with really black pixels to create the appearance of one island. It's clever because it draws your attention to the cutout, but also disguises it, while also taking that space that would have otherwise been wasted and actually puts it to good use. So what does it do? Well, for one, it serves you notifications, like when you connect your AirPods or receive a call, but it also lets you monitor and control different things that are happening in the background of your iPhone. For example, if you're listening to music and you swipe up on the app, the dynamic island displays now playing information as music is playing in the background. A quick tap will open the app, while a longer hold will open the widget where you can quickly access media controls. This works for other apps as well, but generally, a short tap opens the app and a longer hold will open a widget that shows some basic features of whatever app is active. This is really useful because it means multitasking on the iPhone just received a big improvement. Maybe you're reading an article, but you're also boiling some wontons. Well, now you can monitor your timer all on one screen without having to pull down a menu or switch between apps. You can even access controls right there on the dynamic island. Not only that, but when you have two apps running in the background at the same time, the dynamic island split into two, and now you can access the widgets for both the apps. So, it's a big improvement to multitasking overall, which is always a great thing in my books. I've also been wondering, since they brought the notch over to MacBooks, would they ever bring over the dynamic island as well? Would be kind of interesting to see how that integration would work. Anyway, the dynamic island is great, but it's in no way perfect. For example, some things you would expect to appear in the dynamic island aren't compatible yet. It's great that you can see your timer running in the island, very useful. But for some reason, the stopwatch won't appear. The icon doesn't even show up in the island. Not only that, but I don't always have an app running in the background. When that's the case, the dynamic island becomes more of a deserted island. And since the dynamic island sits slower than the old notch, it's a bit harder to ignore. But here's the thing. It's still early days for the dynamic island. I think the island already shows quite a bit of promise, but there's still room for improvement. And it is open to third-party developers, so we'll have to wait and see what the full potential of the dynamic island really is. Let's just hope it doesn't end up like the touch bars that used to be on the MacBooks. Alright, other improvements on the display include a significant increase in brightness. The iPhone 14 Pro Max's display has a whopping 2000 nits of maximum brightness, which is pretty insane. To put it into perspective, last year's iPhone 13 Pro only had a max brightness of 1000 nits, or 1200 nits with HDR content. And the Samsung Galaxy S22 that I had been previously using had a peak brightness of 1300 nits. So this year's iPhone 14 Pro is super bright, which means the phone's display will be bright enough to use even in direct sunlight. Another feature that Apple has included this year is the always-on display. This is something we've seen plenty of times on Android phones, but Apple has been a little late to the party, and this is the first time we're seeing it on an iPhone. And Apple has done things a little differently. So when you hit the power button, the brightness drops, and the torch and camera buttons animate away. But rather than having a completely black screen with the time, like we're accustomed to seeing on Android devices, Apple has decided to keep your wallpaper on the always-on display. If you're listening to music, the album art shows as well, so it pretty much looks like your lock screen on low brightness. It looks nice, but if I'm gonna be honest, I kinda wish Apple just kept it simple with a black screen, because the always on display is still pretty bright. So much so that sometimes I thought I left my phone on. And it doesn't help that the media control buttons still appear on the always on display, even though you can't interact with them. Touching them only wakes up your phone. What I really do enjoy though is the fact that your notifications show up on the always on display. It's just an extra bit of information you can access more easily. Okay, looking at the size of the camera cutouts on the back, you can already tell that these camera sensors are going to be beefy. But that's not all. Apple has also introduced a new photonic photo processing engine, leading to some decent improvements to the overall camera system. Now, for the first time since the iPhone 6s, Apple has decided to increase the megapixel count of the main camera from 12 to 48. And what the iPhone is doing is using that 48 megapixel sensor, taking every 4 pixels and grouping them together into a quad pixel. So the end result is still a 12 megapixel photo, but basically, the bigger sensor means the iPhone is able to increase the amount of light the phone is able to capture. This means faster capturing speeds, better low light performance, and more information for the photonic engine to do its processing. And the photos on the 14 Pro look great. Images are detailed, colors are accurate, and the bigger sensor really allows for some great photos at night or low light conditions, because it is able to let in that extra light to give you that better image. The new 48 megapixel sensor also means the iPhone Pro has a 2x zoom. Since the phone still shoots 12 megapixel photos, the iPhone uses the center 12 megapixels from the 48 megapixel sensor to give you a photo that's zoomed in. Now, I've heard some people say that the iPhone can't take advantage of the quad pixels when using the 2x zoom. Theoretically, that would mean the 2x zoom can't let in as much light and should lead to darker photos in low light settings. But in my testing, I haven't really gotten these results. To me, the photos between the 1x and 2x zoom look pretty comparable. But what do you guys think? Now, where the 48 megapixel sensor really shines is when you shoot photos in Apple ProRAW. In the ProRAW format, the photos don't bin down. Instead, they're captured in full 48 megapixel glory. And these photos look really good. You have a lot more detail in your shots. All the extra pixels means you have the option to crop into a photo while still maintaining a decent resolution. And you have a lot more options for colors if you decide to work on your photo in post. Now, these are all fantastic features, and again, the photos look awesome. But unfortunately, they're not really viable options for everyday shooting. For starters, file sizes are a lot bigger. I'm talking like 100 megabytes. And if you're anything like me, well, I don't offload my photos too often, meaning these photos are going to eat up my storage fast. The phone also takes a bit longer to process photos shot in ProRAW. And for your everyday shooter who wants to whip out their phone and take a couple quick snaps, this is going to be a bit of a hindrance. So I guess the situation is similar to iPhone's ProRes video capabilities. It's a great feature to have, but it's not something you'll use every day. I guess it's more of a pro feature where you want to capture something in detail and have the option to play around with it in post. Speaking of videos, Apple has also introduced a new action mode for capturing videos, which is meant to be used in situations where there's a lot of camera movement, like when you're filming on the move, and it will take your shaky footage and stabilize it. It works pretty well, but you do lose out on resolution because it's taking your 4K footage, picking a point, centering it in frame, and cropping out the sides. So what you end up with is very stable footage that's capped at a 2.8K resolution with 30 FPS and a narrower field of view. When it comes to the internals, the iPhone Pro models, that's the normal sized Pro and the Pro Max that I have here, both get the new A16 Bionic chip with 6 gigs of memory. To be expected from a new flagship iPhone, it performs well. I've tested it with games and I've tested it recording long form video, and it handles everything easy peasy. Alright, I want to quickly talk about the SIM card tray as well. I don't live in the US, so I still have a SIM card tray on my iPhone, but models sold in the US do not come with a SIM card tray, meaning you'll be stuck with eSIM. Now, because models outside of the US still have that SIM tray, Apple hasn't designed the iPhone to have anything extra there. Teardowns show that the US models have a placeholder that occupies that space. So you don't get anything extra there. But I guess by removing the tray, Apple is signaling to the world that they're ready to move on from physical SIMs, which will probably accelerate the shift to eSIMs, because Apple is a market leader. And we've already seen in the past that the market tends to follow Apple's lead, like when they got rid of the headphone jack and stock phone chargers. Now, moving to eSIMs does have its advantages. For instance, you can have multiple eSIMs on your phone. There's a bit of an increase in security because people can't just pop out your SIM card tray if your phone is lost or stolen. And no gap for the SIM card tray means one less gap where water or dirt might enter, which means your phone is more resistant to damage. But the major drawback to no physical SIM is that now it becomes a bit harder to switch SIMs because you can't just pop out your old one and put in a new one. And when it comes to eSIMs, if your phone breaks, you can't just take out your physical SIM to move to a new or temporary phone. You'll have to retrieve your eSIM profile from the cloud, which takes a bit more time. And an older phone that you might need to use temporarily might not have eSIM support at all. So that's definitely something to keep in mind if you're looking at the new iPhone. Alright, those are my thoughts on the iPhone 14 Pro Max. I think it's great to see Apple introducing some new stuff to the iPhone, like the dynamic island and the new camera system, because the iPhone, it's kind of been the same for a while now. Between the dynamic island and a lot of the new changes in iOS 16, I think Apple is definitely trying some new things. But what do you guys think? Do you guys like the dynamic island? Let me know in the comments. Okay, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time.